All right, well, we're continuing here in the lecture in chapter 13 in the PowerPoint. We're going to start with slide number 11 and talking about staffing the bureaucracy. What you have to understand about bureaucrats and the administrative bureaucracy, whether it's in Washington or even local government, is it's a political appointee. So in other words, the director of the FBI, the director of the CIA, the director of the Department of Health and Human Services, the director of Homeland Security. You go through this whole list, the director of the Environmental Protection Agency. They are all political appointees. Okay, in other words, they're not elected. They don't stand for election. And once that president leaves, loses an election, or his term ends and he doesn't run or something of that nature, those political appointees over the heads of these departments basically leave, or generally the new administration appoints new heads of these departments and the old group leaves. But a lot of these underlings still stay there. Okay, we're going to talk about how that happened. But one of the nicknames for the administrative bureaucracy is the aristocracy of the federal government, and it's kind of interesting because in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 says that there should be no title of nobility granted by the U.S. And again, they didn't want kings in the United States, or lords or ladies or dukes or duchesses or anything like that. They were trying to keep that which was in Britain over the United States. But it is interesting, one of the pushbacks on democracy is the fact that that there's a similar kind of title of nobility, and one of the challenges again is firing them. It's very, very difficult. So let's kind of move on here. If you look at slide number 12, again, I've already talked about this before, but he said in Federalist 70, energy and the executive as a leading character of the definition of good government. Again, this idea, energy and executive happens when let's just take the director of the FBI. The director of the FBI is doing exactly what the president wants when it comes to policy. Okay, it becomes a problem, and the executive loses energy when that director starts going rogue and doing its own thing. Now take what happened with Director Comey, who was the previous FBI director under Trump, and started kind of going rogue. Okay, whether you agree or disagree with all that happened, that is a problem, and that is a problem throughout multiple administrations, well before the Trump administration. So let's talk about a little bit about how these administrative bureaucrats kind of do their own thing. Okay, why do they do their own thing? Again, the directors are generally, they're appointed by a president. They can be removed by a president. Okay, there's underlings under those directors. Okay, that are still part of the executive branch. In other words, if you take the EPA, you take the FBI, you take the CIA, you take the IRS, you take Homeland Security, okay? All of these are under the executive branch. They're not under the legislative branch. They're not under the judicial branch. They're all under the executive branch. And part of the problem, again, this swamp that is talked about, is the fact that presidents come and presidents go, but many of these bureaucrats remain. How did that happen? A big part of it was a court case in 1935 called Humphrey's Executor. And this is a case where FDR, as president, appointed an individual who worked in the Securities Exchange Commission. And basically FDR found that this individual who was under the director, okay, was not doing what President FDR wanted him to do, was kind of acting, going rogue, or basically not abiding by his policy choices. And so he fired him. Okay, this individual that was fired sued and said, I was wrongfully terminated. It actually made its way to the Supreme Court. So at issue before the court in Humphrey's Executor versus U.S. was, can a president fire an administrative bureaucrat if it is found that administrative bureaucrat is not doing what the president wants? Again, think it through. If you work for a boss, you're going to, let's just say, sweep the floor. You're going to sweep the floor exactly how that boss wants you to sweep the floor. If you don't do it the way he wants, that boss can fire you. Okay, in other words, you're kind of being insubordinate in some way, shape, or form. That's exactly what was going on here. And so it went before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided against FDR and decided for this bureaucrat. And so what they decided was and what they found out was, once this administrative bureaucrat was appointed by the president, again, what's the president? The president is the executive branch, Article 2 of the Constitution. But what they found is when this underling within the Securities Exchange Commission was doing his job, he was not just executing law, he was also making law, and he was also adjudicating law. So in other words, you've got in one person under the executive branch doing all three branches of government's work, okay, doing the work of all three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial. So the court said, listen, because this individual appointed by an executive branch officer is doing legislative work or judicial work in the same way that a president can't fire a congressman because he's an Article 2, he's an executive branch officer. Once this administrative bureaucrat was doing legislative work, he's now out of the sphere of responsibility and authority of the president. And so the president cannot fire this individual because to do so would violate the separation of powers, which meant that this guy got to keep his job. But what remained was this administrative bureaucrat keeping his job as he was doing legislative, executive, and judicial work. So in other words, you've got individuals within these administrative agencies that are doing the work of all three branches of government in one person. Again, that's a violation of the separation of powers. Again, the incredible irony of this case in trying to prevent a violation of the separation of powers, it inadvertently perpetuated a violation of the separation of powers, because again, now you've got these administrative bureaucrats writing the laws, executing the laws, and then adjudicating the laws that were violated. Okay, so let's look at the case. So this is what the court said. They looked at what this individual was doing in the SEC. They said the commission is to be nonpartisan, and it must, from the very nature of its duties, act with entire impartiality. It is charged with the enforcement of no policy except the policy of law. Its duties are neither political nor executive, but predominantly, here's the phrase that's important, quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative. In other words, this individual is doing legislative work and judicial work, not executive work. So if the president tried to fire him, it would be a violation of the separation of powers. Like the Interstate Commerce Commission, its members are called upon to exercise the trained judgment of a body of experts appointed by law and informed by experience. Going on, the next slide there. The result of what we now have said is this: whether the power of the president to remove an officer shall prevail over the authority of Congress to condition the power by fixing a definite term and precluding a removal except for cause will depend on the character of the office. The Myers decision, again, this is another case, affirming the power of the president alone to make the removal is confined to purely executive officers. In other words, so what they're saying is a president can only remove an individual that's doing exclusively executive branch work. Okay? And as to officers of the kind here under consideration, again, doing all three branches of government's work, we hold that no removal can be made during the prescribed term for which the officer is appointed, except for one or more of the causes named in the applicable statute. To the extent that between the decision in the Myers case, which sustains the unrestrictable power of the president to remove purely executive officers, and our present decision that such power does not extend to an office such as that here involved. So again, a lot of legalese there at the end, but just catch the idea of the Humphreys executive decision. You now have perpetuated individuals appointed by a president within a particular department of the administrative bureaucracy who, once they're in office, maybe either stop doing executive work and do legislative work, or keep doing executive work, but then do legislative work or judicial work. And a president is now not able to remove that particular individual. That's the result of the Humphreys executive decision. Stated another way, the result of the Humphreys executive decision is that led to the creation of the swamp. Okay, so in other words, when they talk about the swamp in Washington, the administrative bureaucracy that presidents have a hard time restraining, it's because of a decision like this one in Humphreys executive. The problem with that, again, if you go to slide number 15, is, again, it's a violation of the separation of powers. The irony of the Humphreys executive decision is, in trying to prevent a violation of the separation of powers by a president removing this executive underling, it perpetuated the violation of the separation of powers because it allowed this underling to stay in office, unable to be removed by the president, who is connected to the people, now doing legislative, executive, and judicial branch work unaccountable to the people and perpetuated in office for an indeterminate length of time. James Madison in Federalist 47 said that, listen, when you combine in one person legislative, executive, and judicial powers in one person, again, think the King of England, it's the very definition of tyranny. So if you look there in slide number 15, you'll see this. He said, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So if James Madison were looking at administrative agencies and individuals doing all three branches of government's work, he would say, look, see that? That's the very definition of tyranny. That's why we basically broke from Great Britain, because we didn't want one person, lodged in one person, the powers of all three branches of government. Okay? Another case. Let's talk about the case called Yackas versus the United States. If you go to slide number 19, you'll see this particular case. This was an issue where there's a principle in government in the Constitution called the non-delegation doctrine. Okay? And what that means is one branch of government cannot delegate to another branch of government their work. So in the case of the legislative branch cannot delegate lawmaking power to the executive branch. That's a violation of the separation of powers. Again, Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution reads, all legislative power is herein granted to a Congress of the United States. In other words, only a congressman can write laws. A president or executive agencies under that president cannot. Yackas versus the United States in 1944 basically broke that apart. Okay, and without getting into this too deeply, because again, it's a relatively complicated case, what was happening during FDR's administration, the Emergency Price Control Act was created, and it controlled commodity prices. Okay, so in other words, you had an executive agency that was basically starting to write laws dealing with the regulation of prices. Okay, so in other words, instead of Congress writing these laws, they punted to an executive agency to write the laws. And so this came before the Supreme Court, and the argument is it a violation of the separation of powers? Is it a violation of the non-delegation doctrine for Congress to delegate lawmaking powers to an administrative agency? And basically, if you look at slide number 21, they said yes. They said Congress may delegate lawmaking power to an administrative agency. If you see the underlined section there, they said they can do that. It's constitutional. It's a constitutional delegation of legislative power if its objective is connected to something that Congress wanted. Okay, so basically what the Yackas case did is kind of open the floodgates now for administrative agencies to basically write the law. So stated another way, many times Congress will write like bullet point form law. In other words, all the specifics is not there. If you've ever seen a bunch of bullet points, okay, you've got bullet points there that basically says generally what this law is supposed to do, but all of the fine print's not there. That's exactly what these administrative agencies are doing, and the court said that that is constitutional. Okay. So where that becomes a problem again is, think it through. You've got unelected administrative bureaucrats writing a great portion of the laws that are passed in this country. And again, they're unaccountable. Okay, if we don't like what they wrote, we can't remove them from office. We can't really say anything about it. We can challenge Congress, but again, Congress is going to say, well, wait a minute, we kind of delegated this and we let them do that. Okay. I think I've talked about this in class, but I'll say it again. This is exactly what Nancy Pelosi meant when, in 2010, when asked what is in Obamacare, she said this famously: we've got to pass the law so that we can see what's in it. Okay, she wasn't just It wasn't a statement of being clueless, and we can argue that all day long. I'm not going to. But basically what she was tipping her hand to the findings of the Yakis case, is this idea that, listen, we don't even know what's in the law. We're going to pass it first. We're going to say vote it into law, or at least pass it, this bill, and get it signed in. And then what it actually is going to say is going to be written later by these administrative agencies. Is that a challenge to Republican government? Absolutely. So I'm going to close right there, and we'll resume after that. All right, take care.